Hey Beaks, today we're going to get into the circulatory system a little bit. Alright, let's get going. So, every organism must exchange materials with its environment, right? Here you can see an axolotl, and they breathe through their gills on their head, which is kind of cool. And eventually, exchanges happen at the cellular level, right? And we have to get things into our cells. So, what are we talking about mainly for us today? We're talking about oxygen, carbon dioxide, gas exchange, right? But there's other things as well that have to get moved around via our circulatory system. Okay, so circulatory systems link exchange surfaces with cells throughout the body. Now, diffusion is only efficient over small distances, and that's why we need a circulatory system. Think about it. If you just breathed in oxygen into your lungs and you expect your pinky toes to get that oxygen diffusing down to it, no, that's not how that's going to work. So a circulatory system is great because it brings the nutrients to the different tissues, different cells that need them, right? So in small and or thin animals, cells can exchange materials directly with the surrounding medium. Like this annelid here, this earthworm, he can actually breathe right through his skin. Okay, so the atmosphere and the skin are interacting all day long, or for the most part. And in most animals, cells exchange materials with the environment via a fluid-filled circulatory system, which we'll see in a second. You also have these gastrovascular cavities. So some animals do not have a circulatory system, but they instead have this cavity that functions both in digestion and in distribution of substances throughout the body. Okay, and the body wall that encloses these is usually very, very thin. Okay, and there you can see an example of a jellyfish and a planarian, right? Okay, so evolutionary variation in circulatory systems here. A circulatory system minimizes the diffusion distance in animals with many cell layers. Okay, so here's a quick little video, and if you don't want to watch this now, you could speed ahead, and it's on YouTube as well. So pretty good stuff, though.
Many of us have hundreds of things on our minds at any moment, often struggling to keep track of everything we need to do. But fortunately, there's one important thing we don't have to worry about remembering: breathing. When you breathe, you transport oxygen to the body's cells to keep them working, and clear your system of the carbon dioxide that this work generates. Breathing, in other words, keeps the body alive. So how do we accomplish this crucial and complex task without even thinking about it? The answer lies in our body's respiratory system. Like any machinery, it consists of specialized components and requires a trigger to start functioning. Here, the components are the structures and tissues making up the lungs, as well as the various other respiratory organs connected to them. And to get this machine moving, we need the autonomic nervous system, our brain's unconscious control center for the vital functions. As the body prepares to take in oxygen-rich air, this system sends a signal to the muscles around your lungs, flattening the diaphragm and contracting the intercostal muscles between your ribs to create more space for the lungs to expand. Air then whooshes into your nose and mouth, through your trachea, and into the bronchi that split at the trachea's base, with one entering each lung. Like tree branches, these small tubes divide into thousands of tinier passages, called bronchioles. It's tempting to think of the lungs as huge balloons, but instead of being hollow, they're actually spongy inside, with the bronchioles running throughout the parenchyma tissue. At the end of each bronchiole is a little air sac called an alveolus, wrapped in capillaries full of red blood cells containing special proteins called hemoglobin. The air you've breathed in fills these sacs, causing the lungs to inflate. Here is where the vital exchange occurs. At this point, the capillaries are packed with carbon dioxide, and the air sacs are full of oxygen. But due to the basic process of diffusion, the molecules of each gas want to move to a place where there is a lower concentration of their kind. So as oxygen crosses over to the capillaries, the hemoglobin grabs it up, while the carbon dioxide is unloaded into the lungs. The oxygen-rich hemoglobin is then transported throughout the body via the bloodstream. But what do our lungs do with all that carbon dioxide? Exhale it, of course. The autonomic nervous system kicks in again, causing the diaphragm to ball up and the intercostal muscles to relax, making the chest cavity smaller and forcing the lungs to compress. The carbon dioxide-rich air is expelled, and the cycle begins again. So that's how these spongy organs keep our bodies efficiently supplied with air. Lungs inhale and exhale between 15 and 25 times a minute, which amounts to an incredible 10,000 liters of air each day. That's a lot of work, but don't sweat it. Your lungs and your autonomic nervous system have got it covered.
Create more space for the lungs to expand. Air then whooshes into your nose and mouth through your trachea.
All right, so general properties of circulatory systems. Circulatory system has a fluid, right, which is blood for us, a set of interconnecting vessels, all right, we'll get into those, and a muscular pump, which is the heart for us, right? And the system connects the fluid that surrounds cells with the organs that exchange gases or, transport nutrients, dispose of waste. And circulatory systems can be open or closed. For example, here, in insects and other arthropods, most mollusks, blood bathes the organs directly in an open circulatory system, right? And in this case, there's no distinction between interstitial fluid, which is kind of like the fluid in between your tissues, and the blood itself. Because it's an open system, it's all just kind of one solution called hemolymph. Okay, so hemolymph is what they have. We, of course, have blood, right? So in a closed circulatory system, like you can see in the worm again here, blood is confined to vessels and is distinct from the interstitial fluid. And we're definitely more efficient at transporting circulatory fluids to tissues and cells, right? Annelids, like we said, are those segmented worms, and cephalopods, like octopus or squid, and vertebrates, which are animals with backbones, have closed circulatory systems. All right. So the organization of this system, human and other vertebrates have a closed system, which is called the cardiovascular system. And the three main types of blood vessels are arteries, veins, and capillaries. Okay, and blood flow is one way in these vessels, and we'll talk about later, if it's not one way, that's a problem, and there's a couple different diseases where that can happen. All right, so arteries branch into arterioles and carry blood away from the heart to the capillaries. Okay, and just some previewing here, so a lot of kids think that arteries are oxygenated and veins are deoxygenated. When you start studying this stuff, forget that. Just remember, arteries away from the heart and veins are traveling back to the heart. Okay. Networks of capillaries, called capillary beds, are the sites of chemical exchange between the blood and the interstitial fluid. Okay, so here you get this nice little tiny blood vessel, and these are only about 1 cell thick. Okay, and a lot of times if you get like a black and blue or whatever, that's you just ripped apart some capillary beds, right? You have some fluid oozing out there, and we'll talk more about that because sometimes it's very normal to lose fluid there. And venules converge into veins and return the blood from the capillaries back to the heart, right? So away from the heart, you have this artery. Here comes the blood from the heart, goes down to an arteriole, gets eventually into these capillaries where you return it now into venules, and then in the veins and back to the heart. All right, and it's a little bit more complex than that, which we'll get into. All right, and again, here's another YouTube video that I got that's pretty good. Okay, so if you just YouTube search reviewing blood vessels, you could skip ahead. If not, here you go.
No doubt about it, your heart is a champion. It electrifies itself, it maintains your blood pressure, it keeps your blood moving, and it's got like a nice shape you can put some chocolates inside of and give to people you like. But the circulatory system is much more than just that pump, because the heart also needs a network to actually send all that blood through, right? Cue the blood vessels. Although it's easy to think of them as a glorified plumbing system for your body, that's not a very good analogy. These aren't just passive tubes made merely to carry liquid around like the pipes behind your walls at your home. Blood vessels are actually active, dynamic organs capable of contracting and expanding as they deliver oxygen and nutrients to cells throughout the body, carry away waste products, and do their part in maintaining that all-important blood pressure. You already know about the three major types of blood vessels: the arteries that carry blood away from the heart, the veins that bring it back, and the little capillaries that act as the transfer station between the two. But you've also got arterioles, which are like mini arteries that branch out into those capillaries, and venules, the smallest vein components that suck blood back out of the capillaries and merge into the larger veins that head home to the heart. And it's quite an incredible journey, really. If all your blood vessels could be strung together in a single line, they'd stretch out for 100,000 kilometers. That's like, if you, and then carry the two It's like 2.5 times around the Earth. And together, this extensive network forms a closed system that begins and ends at the heart. That means that all 5 or so liters of blood in your body are contained within it at all times, unless you're bleeding, which I hope you're not. If you prick a finger and watch a drop of blood pop up, you know that you've nicked a blood vessel, and that blood is leaking out of its closed system. Likewise, if you slam your shin against the corner of a coffee table on your way to the bathroom, and an hour later you see a big nasty bruise forming, then you know you've damaged your blood vessels again, because bruising is internal bleeding, usually into loose connective tissue. And if you're embarrassed about that shriek that you let out when you bumped your leg and you start to blush, well, that's your blood vessels too, expanding, just to say hello. Blood vessels are another great example of how anatomy and physiology go together like peanut butter and jelly. How they look and what they do go hand in hand. Most of your blood vessels share a similar structure consisting of 3 layers of tissue surrounding the open space or lumen that actually holds the blood. Anatomists call these layers tunics, and the innermost section is called the tunica intima, which should be pretty easy to remember because, you know, it's like has intimate contact with the lumen. It's like your circulatory underpants. The cool thing about this layer is that it contains the endothelium, which you may remember is made up of simple squamous epithelium tissue and is continuous with the lining of the heart. These cells form a slick surface that helps the blood move without friction. Surrounding the tunica intima is the middle layer, the tunica media, which is made of smooth muscle cells and sheets of the protein elastin. That smooth muscle tissue is regulated in part by the nerve fibers of the autonomic nervous system, which can decrease the diameter of the lumen by contracting this middle layer during vasoconstriction, or expand it by relaxing during vasodilation. That right there should tell you that the tunica media plays a key role in blood flow and blood pressure, because the smaller the diameter of the blood vessel, the harder it is for blood to move through it. Kind of like trying to drink milk through a cocktail straw versus a soda straw. And finally, the outermost layer of your blood vessels is the tunica externa. It's like an overcoat if that coat were made mostly of loosely woven collagen fiber. Actually, if your coat happens to be made of leather, it is made of collagen, and like a coat, this outer layer is what protects and reinforces the whole blood vessel. Now, the ratio of the thicknesses of these 3 layers varies between blood vessels of different types, because guess what? Yes, form follows function. Let's take a look. Say you're gearing up for a big tournament of thumb wrestling, or what has been called the miniature golf of martial arts. How does blood move through your systemic circulatory loop to get from your heart to your champion right thumb flexing muscle, the flexor pollicis brevis, and back again? Well, you will remember from our lessons on the heart that blood leaves the left ventricle through the aorta, the biggest and toughest artery in your body, roughly the diameter of a garden hose. The aorta and its major branches are elastic arteries. They contain more elastin than any other blood vessel type, so they can absorb the large pressure fluctuations as blood leaves the heart. What's more, that elasticity actually dampens that pressure so that big surges don't reach the smaller vessels where they could cause damage. This is really where that whole pipe analogy falls apart. These arteries are really more like balloons. Their pressure reservoir is able to expand and recoil with every heartbeat. If they were rigid like pipes, they'd eventually leak or burst after being battered by so many waves of pressure. So that blood leaves your aorta, and since it's heading to your thumb, it travels along the elastic subclavian artery, which gives way to a series of muscular arteries, in this case the brachial artery in your upper arm, and the radial artery in the lower arm. Muscular arteries distribute blood to specific body parts and account for most of your named arteries. They're less elastic and more muscular. These arteries invest in additional smooth muscle tissue and proportionally have the thickest tunica media of any blood vessel. This allows them to contract or relax through vasoconstriction and vasodilation, which we've talked about a lot in terms of the nervous system's stress response. These arteries keep tapering down until they turn into the nearly microscopic arterioles that feed into the smallest of your blood vessels, your tiny, extremely thin-walled capillaries, which serve as a sort of exchange or bridge between your arterial and venous systems. They may be little, but your capillaries are where the big important exchange of materials actually happens. Capillary walls are made of just a single layer of epithelial tissue, which form only the tunica intima, so they're able to deliver oxygen and other nutrients in your blood to their cellular destinations through diffusion. The capillaries are also where those cells can dump their carbon dioxide and other waste back into the blood and send it away, through the veins to the lungs and kidneys, but we'll come back to that in a second. Unlike arteries and veins, capillaries don't operate on their own, but rather form interweaving groups called capillary beds. Besides exchanging nutrients and gases, your capillary beds also help regulate blood pressure and play a role in thermoregulation. Say you're in the room where you're practicing your thumb calisthenics, which probably isn't the thing, but the room is a little chilly, so the blood feeding your dermis loses a lot of heat to that cold air. Well, smooth muscle forms tiny sphincters, yeah, you got sphincters everywhere, around the vessels that lead to each of your capillary beds. When they tighten up, they force blood to bypass some of those capillaries, which means less blood is exposed to the cold, and you lose less heat. If it's really cold, the smooth muscles around your larger arterioles and muscular arteries, like that radial artery in your lower arm, will also squeeze, slowing blood flow to your whole hand, which is no way to win at thumb wrestling. But it's one reason why your fingers get all stiff and numb in the cold. They're not getting as much warm blood because your blood vessels are trying to conserve heat. Conversely, if your thumb is working really hard and producing heat from all that exertion, those capillary sphincters relax and open wide, flooding the capillary bed with blood to help disperse heat, which is part of the reason that you might get red-faced when you're hot or exercising hard. So anyway, now your thumb muscles have just feasted on a batch of oxygen and glucose served up on a fresh bed of capillary, and they're ready to take out the trash. The cells send their CO2 and other junk out to the venal end of the capillary exchange, where the capillaries unite into venules and then merge into veins that head back to the heart. Remember that the pressure in these vessels has to be dropping, since fluids always flow from higher to lower pressure. But since the pressure is so low in your veins, it's like 1/12 of the pressure in your arteries, there isn't much pressure gradient left to push the blood back to your heart. So veins require some extra adaptations to keep the blood moving in the right direction. That's why some of them, especially veins in the arms and legs that have to work against gravity, have venous valves that help keep the blood from flowing backward. If those valves leak or a vein experiences too much pressure, the backflow of blood can stretch and twist the vein, leaving you with varicose veins, or if this happens in another part of the body, hemorrhoids. But anyway, we've gotten pretty far from your thumb at this point. We got a loop to finish here. From the capillaries and venules in your thumb, that low-pressure blood flows from the radial vein to the brachial vein to the subclavian vein, where it dumps into the superior vena cava and settles for a second in the right atria before dropping into the right ventricle. From there, it's sent to the lungs, where it gets oxygenated and then comes back into the left atria before sliding down into the left ventricle, where it builds up pressure again and spurts back out into your aorta. It takes about a minute for all the blood in your body to complete that circuit, which means even if you're mostly at rest, your hard-working circulatory system moves about 7,500 liters of blood through your heart every day. Just in the time that you've been sitting there listening to me, probably about 52 liters has coursed through. So yes, much like the internet, your blood vessels are more than just a series of tubes. During the time that you've been circulating all that blood, you learned about the basic three-layer structure of your blood vessels, how those structures differ slightly in different types of vessels, and you followed the flow of blood from your heart to capillaries in your right thumb and all the way back to your heart again. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making videos like this, you can go to patreon.com/Crash Course. Also, a big thank you to Matthew Pierce for co-sponsoring this episode of Crash Course Anatomy and Physiology. This episode of Crash Course was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake D. Pastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins. The editor and script supervisor is Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Ronda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay, so I hope that was helpful. So as we said, arteries and veins are distinguished by the direction of blood flow, not by oxygen content. Vertebrate hearts contain 2 or more chambers. On the right here you can see that's a human heart there. Okay, and blood enters through an atrium and is pumped out through a ventricle, which we'll get really good at the heart anatomy as we go through this unit. So you could have a single circulation circuit, okay, like bony fishes, rays, sharks have a single circulation with a 2-chambered heart. So basically, as you can see there, the heart pumps out the blood to the gills, okay, and then those gills, it just keeps moving right through. That's where the oxygen exchange and the carbon dioxide exchange happens, and it just keeps on moving right to the body cells, okay, to the capillaries. So that's how all the cells get their oxygen, is just in that single circuit. In double circulation, like amphibians, reptiles, and us, we have oxygen poor and oxygen rich blood are pumped separately. Okay, so as you can see here, we have a pulmonary circuit and then we have a systemic circuit. So it's a pretty neat system, right? We go to our lungs to pick up the oxygen, give off the CO2, and then we go through the body to let loose the oxygen and pick up the CO2, and go back to the lungs to give up the CO2, pick up the oxygen. So this double circuit is a really cool thing that we have. In reptiles and mammals, oxygen-poor blood flows through the pulmonary circuit to pick up oxygen, like we just said, and oxygen-rich blood delivers oxygen throughout the systemic circuit. So all the way down to your toes, right? You have little capillaries there. Double circulation maintains higher blood pressure in the organs than does single circulation. So we'll also be talking about that this unit, your blood pressure and how to test it and how it changes as it travels through these blood vessels. Adaptations of double circulatory systems, and you can take a look here. The heart has changed, and we don't spend too much time on it. I know you guys just finished your evolution unit, but it's really cool that you can see how the heart has changed from different types of organisms. Right, really cool stuff. So mammals and birds, we have a 4-chambered heart with 2 atria and 2 ventricles. So the left side of the heart pumps and receives only oxygen-rich blood, while the right side receives and pumps only oxygen-poor blood. Mammals and birds and endotherms are endotherms, and we require more O2 than ectotherms. So we're going to talk about how the left side of your heart is actually stronger and bigger because that's the one pumping to your body, right, to your systemic circuit, which is, you know, up in your head and your arms and your torso and your feet and all that stuff, right? Whereas the pulmonary circuit, the right side of your heart can be a little smaller because you're only going to your lungs and back. The trip is much shorter. All right, so that was pretty much just a little introduction to the circulatory system. We're going to stop there, okay? And one thing that I normally do here, if you haven't watched, it's called Can We Eat to Starve Cancer? It's a TED Talk. Now, most of you already saw that before because I probably showed it to you during the cancer unit, but if you haven't seen that, it's about a 20-minute TED Talk that you really should go take a look at because it's all about how cancer cells can lead to angiogenesis, which is the creation of these blood vessels to feed it even more, right? And that'll cause the cancer to get stronger and be able to grow and spread even easier. So anyway, the little introduction to the circulatory system, we'll dive in a bit deeper next time. Okay, hope that was helpful.